What are the key differences between early moderns and late moderns? And how do we work across the great generational divide between the elder and younger generations? In the first video of this series, I described who the generations are and why we should name them differently so we can understand what's actually happening in the United States today. In particular, I discussed the technology changes that are involved. In this video, I'll discuss the bigger issue. I'll describe the realities of late modern society and focus on the hallmarks of late moderns compared to early moderns. My hope is that an understanding of these hallmarks will allow greater understanding across the generations. Do note that I assume you've watched the first video. Also, there's a very large literature about late modernity, and you should understand that this video is just my engagement with that larger discussion. Based on my reading of the lit and my own research with over 18,000 college students in the United States, I've put together my conclusions here. They're just meant to encourage thinking and discussion. So let's take a look at the real cohort effects of late moderns. In the first video, I discussed birth years. Birth years are used to identify cohorts of people who live in a particular place and time and were shaped into the people they are because of those shared experiences. Cohort realities help us understand who the people are in the GI generation, the silent generation, the baby boom generation, and so forth. Based on some key changes in technology across the last 120 years, I suggested some new names for generations X, Y, and Z. So the names we use could help us better understand who they are. I called them the cloud generation, the internet generation, and the computer generation. This list of 6 generations can be seen as the older generations, who are industrial natives, and the younger generations, who are digital natives. This allows us to see how the older generations understand reality differently than the younger generations, even if all the generations are now living in a late modern society. All of this was explained and unpacked in the first video in this series. We do need to unpack the societal arrangement in late modern society. Understanding the interconnection between the societal arrangements, the social structure and culture of the society, and the technology of the time will allow us to see the nature of the gulf between the older and younger generations. Most importantly, it'll let us identify the hallmarks of early moderns and the hallmarks of late moderns and how they're different. Many researchers and social theorists have done work on late modern society. Most of them, though, are trying to accomplish some larger task than just clarify what late modern society looks like. Which means we get too far off track if we try to discuss that broad literature. So to serve our purpose here, I'm going to make some gross oversimplifications and identify 5 hallmarks of late modern societies. Late modern societies are more malleable than early modern ones. Much like the internet has an ever-changing shape while a steam engine stays the same once it's built, late modern societies are metaphorically more liquid than solid, while early modern societies are more solid than liquid. Late modern societies also are tied into global social arrangements much more comprehensively than early modern societies were. Early modern societies definitely were part of a global arrangement, but the political, economic, and other aspects of the nation-states stood more independently within that global system than is true in late modern society. Late modern societies have fewer boundaries around access to information than early modern societies did. This is such a noteworthy aspect of late modern societies that many folks refer to them as information societies. Late modern societies are also much more aware of pluralism within and around them. Pluralism in ethnicity, creed, and everything else. The final hallmark is that late modern societies have a changing nature of inequality compared to early modern societies. Inequality with regard to resources, power, life chances, and many other things. So let's look at what these traits of late modern societies look like in practice, so we can figure out how the people in the generation is different. So let's compare 3 groups of people. The people born in 1960, the people born in 1990, and the people born in 2020. Let's look at some specific aspects of the United States economy as experienced by these 3 cohorts to begin to see how late modernity plays out for them. First, let's consider the labor market. This line graph shows the number of full-time workers who were in manufacturing jobs at any given time. At the far left is the number for 1965, and at the far right is the number for 2019. Now, the people born in 1960 were 20 years old in 1980. If that's about the time they entered a serious engagement with the full-time labor market, they entered a labor market with a notable proportion of people working in manufacturing jobs. The people born in 1990 turned 20 in 2010. They entered a labor market with a much smaller number and proportion of people working in manufacturing jobs. Keep in mind, while the number in manufacturing has gone down, the population size actually was increasing. The people being born today, 2020, are unlikely to know a time when manufacturing jobs are a major part of the labor market. Instead, the people born in 1990 and in 2020 are experiencing a job market with more constant change and an economy with more complicated global supply chains. Or let's talk about the consumption side of the economy. This line graph shows the percentage of retail shopping in the United States that was done online. At the far left, we see that the percent purchased online in the fourth quarter of 1999 was nearly zero. But the percentage of retail shopping that was done online in the first quarter of 2019 was 11%. So across that time, online retail spending went from basically nothing to over 10% of the retail spending in the country. Let's make some sense of that within the context of the lifespans of these three birth cohorts. People born in 1960 were 59 years old in 2019. They were 39 years old in 1999 when we could say online purchasing even began. So they have lived most of their life in times when online retail didn't exist. The people born in 1990 were 9 years old when online retail began and 29 years old when it was over 10% of retail in 2019. More of their life has been lived in times when online retail was a reality than in times when it wasn't. For the folks being born now, online retail will always have been a normal part of reality. They will perceive it in entirely different ways than our 1960 boomer birth cohort. Buying online is not normal reality for boomers in the same way it will be, and is, for the internet generation or the cloud generation. Now, this can also be demonstrated by smartphone use for purchasing. In this 2016 data, 19% of boomers said they had made at least 2 online purchases in a typical 3-month period. And 63% of the internet generation said they had used their smartphones to make 2 or more purchases in a typical 3-month period. Now, the 2020 birth cohort obviously is just being born, and they aren't buying anything online, but if we can imagine them being at an age where they could be doing online shopping by phone, this linear increase across the trend would mean 85% of them would be doing online purchases in this way. Online purchases by phone will be as normal to the cloud generation as sun or rain. They expect to see constantly changing arrays of goods and services offered through invisible but complicated systems that allow them instant access to consumption options and a huge variety of consumption options. Now, this actually suggests a topic that we have to consider because it's so central to late modern society discussions: access to information. The formative realities of information access for the generations is central to our understanding of generational differences. The 1960 kids grew up with a rotary dial landline telephone. When we needed, and yes, I am one of them, when we needed to contact our parents from school, we had to find a payphone. Phone numbers that we experienced were assigned to a place and could not be used elsewhere. Long-distance calls, that would just mean to places only a few dozen miles away, incurred extra charges. The 1990 kids saw cell phones, the early version. For those who had the income to get them, these cell phones were items that could be carried with you, and you could reach your parents from most urban places. Cell towers weren't everywhere yet, but if your car broke down in most places, you could call mom and dad right from the car. Now, the 2020 kids grow up with microcomputers that we call phones. These smartphones can call just about anywhere, anytime, And in fact, the phone is a tool that allows access to a world information, and it's always connected. See the difference between these three generations and how they understand basic access to other people through technology. Now, that smartphone, though, introduces access to much more than just calling people. The 1960s kids used something called an encyclopedia. It was bound in books. And even at home, you could have one if the family was wealthy enough. But at least you probably had it in your school. The 1990s kids and the 2020 kids have online encyclopedias that are always at their fingertips. The 1960s kids perceived information as a commodity that came from a central authority with limited content and that changed only every few years when the school spent the money to buy the latest edition. The younger generations assume the reality of instant information that is decentralized in control, unlimited, practically speaking, in scope, and it's changing every moment of every day. Now here's a final example of information access. The 1960s kids grew up with 3 broadcast networks. These were controlled by 3 central corporations and were bounded by government regulation intended to make sure the content was appropriate. The 1990s kids grew up with cable systems that had hundreds of channels and had much greater latitude in what they showed, how they showed, and why they showed it. But the 2020 kids, they're growing up with all of the above and an ever-changing array of streaming services. The cloud is now their source of information, entertainment, and kind of everything else. The decentralization has allowed more than one point of view to be heard. Every person playing a major hero role in the information that they access doesn't have to be the same color or gender. Music styles that couldn't be heard in the carefully controlled music industry or radio networks of the 1960s now have ways to be heard. This decentralized global system is constantly changing and has far fewer limitations on what can be included. It allows the real pluralism around us that has always been there to now be seen more easily. Interestingly, though, this cloud of sources has not stopped people from walling themselves off from different groups than their own. Many people in the late modern United States only listen to Fox News if they are well to the political right, or only to MSNBC if they are well to the political left. And their understanding of other groups is only developed through sources inside their bubble, which means they usually have a distorted and biased understanding of what other groups elsewhere even think. Additionally, the advances that have limited the ability of any one group to make sure only their view is heard has also created so many sources of information that we're surrounded by deceptive sources. Now, all of this kind of hints at the obvious need to look at politics. Well, look, I'll admit it, there's just no way to discuss all of the ways politics has changed with the advent of late modern society, but well, I'm not even going to try. I'll just make one quick observation. If we look at the last 11 men who have been president of the United States, we begin with John F. Kennedy, who was the first president to be elected to a notable extent because he outperformed his opponent in the new television medium. No president before him had gained so much traction from having used the television medium as a campaigning mechanism. In fact, the first 7 presidents on this list all campaigned primarily through television. Then, in the 1990s, when the internet began, and our 1990s kids were born, campaigning expanded to websites and cable shows. But it wasn't until Barack Obama that we had social media campaigning, because there wasn't any social media of sufficient scope before then, and there wasn't a candidate young enough to prioritize cloud-based technologies as a campaigning strategy. But that ship has now sailed, and every candidate must compete in the cloud reality. Those first presidents on the list were much more controlled by the centralized power of the political party system. That system didn't really embrace change very much. People were expected to work their way up the ranks and serve the party for years before they might be given the chance to pursue some higher office. But social media has vastly more than television allowed things like a senator in his first term in the Senate, or a reality television personality with no knowledge of the political system, to bypass the entire political party system and end up holding the highest office in the nation. In fact, with 24-hour websites and social media of many sorts now available, it's possible to imagine that presidents will not be chosen on any more merit than being able to get attention and spin a story about themselves and the United States. It's even true now that the actual arrangements of the government can be sidestepped to some degree through direct appeals to a fan base in the social media. This could actually be a time of politics by tweet, where major political leaders can raise a fan base movement and thus can partially ignore the government processes, the political parties, and the traditional news media, which they can then convince everyone shouldn't be trusted. The cloud generation is growing up in a reality where manipulation of a story can be done directly to a fan base. Okay, well, that's enough of that. In fact, let's just say that all the social arrangements in late modern society are different from early modern society. Think about the ways that all the systems in society have changed for these three birth cohorts. If you're old enough, you'll remember that the nature of the family was quite different 60 years ago than it is now. Education in a world where so much information is available online all the time is undergoing a transformation. I'm going to speak more about education in particular in a later video. The role of religion in society and the form of religious organizations is under great change. That's also going to be a topic when I look at the faith of the younger generations in a later video. Healthcare in every other late modern society than the United States has been made to some extent a public good where the government becomes involved in controlled prices or in provision of medical care, because in the late modern setting, it's no longer possible to have true free market competition and informed consumers buying the medical services. Now, late modernity is still an extension of modern society as far as we see it, but it's powerfully different than early modern societies. Our 1960s kids grew up on a different planet almost than the one the 2020 kids are growing up in. Okay, let's summarize. People born before 1964 grew up in an early modern society. And people born in the later generations grew up in a late modern society. The early moderns grew up with an economy, a political system, and everything else that operated more like a cog and shaft machine than the internet. The late moderns grew up with social systems that are more fluid and are more like the internet than an industrial machine. And this difference in their social arrangements is shaping their very understanding of the nature of reality. Knowing all this, we can finally identify the key hallmarks of early moderns and late moderns. And now I'm talking about the people, not the society types. Or more accurately, I'm going to tell you what I think these key hallmarks are, and you can decide to what extent you agree or find them not as plausible. The first hallmark of late moderns is an increased prioritization of self-expressive individualism over civil liberties individualism. Everyone realizes that individualism is key in the United States, and most folks can see that individualism has changed in the last few decades. If we think back to the first 150 years of the United States, we see a country that was wrestling with and expanding individual civil liberties. Democracy, free market economy, the Bill of Rights, the battle over slavery, all of these were, at least in part, a working out of civil rights individualism. In the 1960s, though, the shift to late modern individualism began. Now, this was not a disavowal of civil rights. This was an expansion of individualism beyond civil liberties to self-expression. The right to be who you want to be, regardless of societal expectations and cultural norms. Across the last 60 years, while civil rights liberties have continued to matter in the United States and be part of the central discussion, self-expressive individualism has become more and more important and a bigger discussion for the younger generations. In the 2010s, we see a social landscape where people still argue for civil liberties but also believe they have the right to choose whatever best expresses themselves as who they wish to be. Now, if you're a cog in the industrial machine, your identity is defined by your place in the system, and you don't think about self-expressive individualism as much. But if you're one of the elements in the interconnected digital cloud, your identity is defined by how you choose to present yourself and connect. Like all the hallmarks of late modernity, expressive individualism exhibits possibility and peril. Expressive individualism provides the possibility of greater fulfillment in individuals' lives. but it runs the risk of self-destructive narcissism. Those who trust the old ways will see the dangers. Those who embrace the new ways will see the possibilities. A second hallmark of late moderns is a shift from a hierarchical authority to identity group authority. Folks raised in early modern industrial society know that social organization is fundamentally based on hierarchy and that authority is associated with organizational position. These early moderns will assume that a synonym for non-hierarchical is anarchy. To question the innate authority of those who hold organizational positions, the police, teachers, elected officials, medical doctors, is tantamount to the undermining of the whole social order. Late moderns, however, don't start with, nor necessarily even understand, why non-hierarchical arrangements must mean anarchy. Late moderns definitely still understand and live within hierarchical social arrangements, but they also expect a pluralistic and fluid, which is to say a non-hierarchical, social reality. Organizational arrangements, they think, can take a variety of forms, with traditional hierarchy being only one option. Yes, authority is associated with organizational position, they would say, but there's a cynicism about that authority. The legitimacy of the authority of others can be decided now by the observer as much as, or maybe more than, identified from the organizational position they hold. In the 1950s United States, the president, medical doctors, and others were believed and obeyed in general because they held positions of authority. In today's United States, anyone can find any niche group online that they might want to look at. Groups can be found that advocate particular political views, and only those views, that advocate particular nutrition or health lifestyle or entertainment choices, and only those, and so forth. Membership in these groups shapes views of traditional authorities. In a reality defined by pluralism, group membership within the ocean of different groups might be the more important frame through which people decide which authorities to trust. Holding an organizational position of authority still is consequential, but the days when all students accepted their teachers' claims at face value are long gone. Put another way, if you're a cog in the machine, authority is clear-cut. Power is transmitted through the mechanisms of the machine in a straightforward way. If you're an element in the cloud, you decide which authority to connect to. The third shift that I want to focus on is a shift from linear logic to probabilistic logic. Now again, folks raised in early modern society will assume if someone says they're non-linear, that those people are basically all about chaos. But that's not what it means to late moderns. To better understand this, we need to make a brief excursus into the realms of the physical sciences. Early modern science, the science that helped usher in the industrial age, was very linear. The steam engine is a very linear device. Newtonian physics has a very mechanistic and linear understanding of the universe. And those understandings are limited, and in some ways they're actually wrong. So I'll tell you a story. I'll tell you a story about a boy, and that would be me, who learned in elementary school in the 1960s and 1970s that certain things were true about reality. 10 years later, when he was in college in the 70s and 80s, he learned that all those things were wrong. When I was a child, I learned about the atom. You see, it has a nucleus comprised of protons and neutrons, and around that center are electrons, and they travel in orbits around the nucleus. Just like the planets in the solar system, I was told. But, that's not actually true. Electrons don't orbit the center in predictable orbits. They exist more as mass-energy probabilities around the nucleus. In fact, what I was taught as a boy about atomic particles has mostly been found to be only partly right now. But back then, everything was perceived as linear and predictable, at least in the understanding of the general population. It's true that scientists, more broadly, knew better about a number of these things well before the broader culture did. Quantum physics, which studied the atomic and subatomic, understands reality differently than Newtonian physics did. Now, when I was a boy in the 1960s, scientific understanding was still perceived by the general population as a linear process. And today, no one thinks of it that way because the technology affecting us most in our daily life isn't like the blender in the kitchen. The blender is a very linear machine. You have power, and it turns a shaft. Now, the technology affecting our lives today is a set of incomprehensible devices that all communicate without wires. Even in the days of cable in the 1990s, When people had a cable line coming in connected to their VCR, they could point at physical things and say, well, the TV signal comes in through that wire, goes into that box, and the box records the information on a physical tape that moves linearly from one reel to the other. But today, people stream a show and record things from the cloud. They use their phone, in quotes, to change the room temperature or to chat with their friends anywhere, anytime. Nothing is connected physically. There's no seeming linearity to any of it. Older folks still think in linear terms, and they think to be logical means you must be linear. Younger generations have grown up in a world where everything connects to everything else. That's just how it is. And there's no implicit sense of linearity to most of it. This also means, unfortunately, that some late moderns have a magic box understanding of society that's so ungrounded they may actually have lost an awareness of causality. As was said in the earlier highlight, there are ups and downs to this, and some will see the dangers and some will see the benefits. Now, the final hallmark, I think, defines late moderns is a shift from absolute truth to tentative truth. Folks raised in early modern society knew many true facts. But as time went on, many of them, including scientific facts, political facts, sociological facts, and theological facts, proved to not necessarily be true at all. Those facts made sense at the time. They were our best answers we could come up with at the time, but they were limited or flat out wrong. The younger generations are less willing to make absolute claims. The pluralism and liquidity, the inequality differences, all of the different elements of late modern society that they see all around them, makes them less willing to embrace absolutism. This has led many to claim that we are now in a post-truth world because they say younger generations are post-truth. But here's the important fact. There appears to be less evidence that younger generations don't believe in objective physical, sociological, and theological truth than evidence that they just don't trust that the older generations, or maybe anybody, knows what that objective truth is. Since the older generations have made a mess of things and used their truths, both physical and sociological, both theological and otherwise, to justify wide varieties of self-serving goals, it's reasonable, say the younger generations, to be skeptical that the older generations actually know what the objective truth really is. Well, let's put this another way. It's not the same thing to say that there is objective truth and to say that we know what the objective truth is. It's quite possible that many of the younger generation folks agree that there are objective truths. I've had conversations and interactions with many students who say exactly that. But they're not as certain that we know what they are. They're not as certain we can apprehend the fullness of truth from our limited perspectives. They're skeptical that any particular one group in this pluralistic reality is correct in claiming that they alone know the one true objective truth. It's very important to understand that most late moderns do believe particular truths, and they believe them fully. What's different is their lower willingness to be certain they have the one truth completely figured out, or that they have a right to make other people believe the same things that they believe. For anyone seeking to connect with generations across the early modern to late modern divide, it's critical to know how early moderns and late moderns are fundamentally different. In this video, I considered the cohort realities and social arrangements that have created the generations we have. But there's another discussion that's really needed before we can apply any of this in practical ways. You see, while the cohort effect of late modernity is the big story, there's also a profound life stage change that complicates all of this. These same people who are late moderns happen to be living at a time when a new life stage has come along and they're experiencing it, and the older generations never experienced that life stage. It's called emerging adulthood, and I'm going to discuss it in the third video.